Yeah.
Delegate Byron, you're going, nice song.
I will call us to order. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hey, it's so good to see everybody and get a chance to talk about a very important issue again, broadband. And first off, we will, because there's a lot of folks that join us virtually now, I would encourage everyone, I know it's a long ride and it's very helpful to everyone at times to be able to at least participate. But anytime you can make that effort to drive and just get away from your office for the day, it's so nice to see faces and be able to talk in person. So yes, virtually to try and do that. But if we could have staff call the roll.
Yes, ma'am. So Delegate Byron, got you present. Delegate Leftwich. Delegate Reed,
Present.
Senator Boysko,
Here.
Senator Hoshby,
Here.
Senator Lewis. Joining us online. Steve Sandy, joining us online. Ray Lemura.
Here.
Casey Logan. Here. Rich Shulman. Here. Here. Mike Cole.
Here.
Christy Proctor, you joining us online.
Yes, I am here.
Secretary Merrick or Representative. Secretary Lohr, Representative.
Beth Green is here.
Forum is present.
Chandler, could you hear me?
One. Yeah. All right, so we have a great facility here that you have been invited and hosted today to have our meeting at, and I want to recognize Gary Wood as our host and ask him if he wants to make some brief remarks with Firefly Fiber Broadband. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Y'all have a lot of work to do, so I won't take very long. Welcome to the training center from the electric co-op perspective for electric linemen and a growing fiber program as well, where we did some training for fiber line techs and splicing, and we'll continue to expand that hopefully, and that may be one of the things to talk about at some point. Let me also take the opportunity to thank all of us. Virginia is recognized as one of the states that's at the lead for broadband. You've done a good job early on. There are states who have just getting started with the BEAD funding and starting their program. We're in the lead. We want to stay in the lead, which means we still have more work with it. And you've got a great team to do it. I want to take this moment to recognize these. I'll have to spread around the entire state to the programs that have now. They have folks, they have agency to work with in terms of grants and helping coordinate several federal agencies and some other state groups. And I won't pick on those, but I will recognize the best. And
Game you see, it's not
here, we are not, it would help get a grant in the last. One decade. No.
So that's why you're up here trying to get one of them.
Thank you. Enjoy today. And thanks for all the work with us.
I can ask you a question though. Gary, certainly thank you for sponsoring this. Are you prepared to show any of us that are able to stay some of your training?
Let me see if I can get some of the folks here who actually know where all of it is to lead.
In that, I'm sorry, but I'm very interested. And you can tell me that later.
All right, we're going to go a break.
Yay. Next on our agenda is the minutes from the June 9th meeting. Hopefully you've all read through those and anyone have any changes that they need to make? Okay, you have a motion to approve those? Okay, all right, all in favor?
Aye. Mhm.
All right, those are approved. All right, next on the agenda is the broadband updates. We have our Tamara Holmes with us to get us started.
Flipping in the chat, Steve Sandy is now up.
Okay.
Actually gonna do a couple of roundtable discussions on from body program, what what's happening now, the other program applications, so we can and I don't propose to the brief day of the Virginia communication meeting. You can do an update on that. And so Gary kind of talked about the program started at $1 million back in. We have grown tremendously since then, and so currently are managing $935 million in project that leveraged $1.2 billion in funding. Also, just to show that the program is still oversubscribed, we received 235 applications from 2017 to 2023. And we currently have 87 projects awarded across 80 localities in the state. We just recently announced another award in May of this year, and so we had 35 applications from 50 localities requesting $3 million. So we did award $59.5 million in one letter of intent. And so those sets of projects awarded in May will leverage $118 million in funding. What's new about this round of body, there were 5 localities that had no previous body project that were awarded as part of the May round. And so that round alone will connect 27,000 plus locations across the state. And so we're excited to keep the train on the track and keep the momentum going in the Commonwealth. And so we'll talk a little bit about the BEAD program and explain how that will continue to help us close the divide and predict. Next slide. And so this is just really a graphic depiction of the funding, as most folks have been around since the beginning. And so the $1 million in 2017, the high in 2021, 2022, $750 million. Thank you to the members of the General Assembly for both the American Rescue Plan funding and capital project funds as well. And so now we're back to our traditional state general fund allocation, and so we allocate the forthcoming 1.15 to talk about the federal fund.
Thanks, Tamara, and we are doing this presentation by committee, so we're going to be dropping back and forth here. The first agenda item past the general updates are the 2024 Virginia Telecommunication Initiative guidelines and criteria. We'll say from the beginning that our thinking here is keep the guidelines close to the same, address what the necessary issues are, but fully admitting this, and Gary Wood hinted towards it earlier, we didn't get to a lot of good projects last year with the level of funding we had for state general fund dollars. We had about $100 million of projects that were still well designed, in our opinion, that we can be able to get to if we streamline the guidelines process. We've made what we think are necessary tweaks, 2 of which, the first one is an amendment to accommodate BEAD funding. You might remember in 2021, we were able to route American Rescue Plan dollars through the body mechanism, straight through the state grant program. The BEAD program is different. We'll cover that in a couple of slides. But under BEAD, we're standing up a separate grant making process, separate guidelines, separate criteria, separate application window, because of the federal rules that have to be accommodated for in that process. So we can't route BEAD dollars through body as we know it. We want to make smart funding decisions across the 2 programs. So Cole, if you go to the next slide. This slide is the key points from the previous couple of paragraphs, where essentially what we're saying is, as an office and body awards next cycle, if we adopt this guidance and depending on public comment received, we as an office could make decisions that would allow us to channel state funds in areas that aren't BEAD eligible. So there's places that have USDA loans, for example, accelerating other federally funded programs like the Broadband program, funding and investing in wireless solutions that aren't eligible for BEAD immediately. This guideline would give us the flexibility to go to a body applicant and say, hey, send us what you have or what your dollars and figures are for this USDA urban area. Maybe we can get there in state general funds and get to the rest of the area with BEAD dollars. So we're trying to have the flexibility there to accommodate and make smart investments across both programs. Next slide. Yes. We want to speak to a little bit of how the two coming together. As the council is familiar with, the body program, local governments are required to be the applicants in partnership with the private sector broadband provider. Under the BEAD program, guidance requires us to invite proposals directly from broadband providers. So our guidance here is that local governments should come into the body process for state general fund dollars as they have for the last 8 funding cycles now. At the same time, though, they should also be studying the BEAD program and issuing letters of support for particular providers they have probably come in. They could work with in terms of who got BEAD funding. So we'll cover that. We'll cover that letter of support structure later on in the presentation. Next slide. The second addition to the evaluation criteria this year is a short one, and we're going to hear about it later on as well. We're adding a question about make-ready practices, so toll permitting, any kind of easement permitting, things that streamline construction. If a provider and a local government are going out on a limb to engage in those activities to streamline construction and the application process, we want to know that, and one of the important points for doing that. So that's the secondary criteria we're proposing to add this year. Next slide. You'll see here the same points mixture is reflected. The Commonwealth priorities will be shifted around a little bit to make points available for that make ready question. Next slide. And with that, I'm turning it back over to Tamara to talk the 5-year plan.
Does anybody have any questions up to this point? I don't want to like race through so quick that somebody doesn't have anything to ask. Is there anybody? You'll let me know if there's someone online. If any questions? Second. And some of these you said we would bring on again later.
So I'm coming back to talk about the BEAD program, and so I just want to really just lay forth. There are 3 different things that we have to provide. We talked about it at the last Broadband Advisory Council meeting, a 5-year plan, initial proposal, which are in 2 volumes, which Christine will talk about in detail in a moment. But I want to share with you all where we landed in terms of the 5-year goals and objectives. In order to access this money, there are many good hurdles we have to go and get over. And so the submitting this 5-year plan was one of those things, and we actually published it last week.
What?
2 weeks ago. So we published it 2 weeks ago on the DHCD website. And so the first goal is to invest BEAD funding to achieve functionally universal broadband access by the end of 2024 to all unserved and underserved locations in the state that lack a funded solution. And so Chandler kind of touched on it earlier that there are some projects that were really good projects that came in the last round of body. However, because we only had $59.5 million, $59.5 million in funding, there were several projects that were unfunded the last round. And so it's our hope that whether they come in for this upcoming round of body or if they come in for BEAD funding, we will be able to fund those projects that way. The other thing is to remove barriers and special construction costs for broadband access. We all know we have a line extension customer assistance program. That's the LECAP program, which we'll present on later. We also don't want to make sure that we cover those residents who have to pay special construction costs to get access to their homes. The next goal is to complete construction of BEAD funded projects by 2028. And so by allocating the money by the end of 2024 to every unserved and underserved location, the expectation is that we would have these projects built out between 36 and 48 months based on the timeline provided from the federal government who administers the program.
I have some questions when you're ready.
Yes.
Okay, so is there a deadline date for the funding, applying and using?
So my understanding is that 2031, the entire program has to be done by 2031, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right, but the project timeline providers to complete the projects for you.
What about using federal funding? Do they have deadlines on that?
2031.
2030.
Okay, there's nothing that's sooner than that we,
We can put parameters in to accelerate the projects.
okay. And then my next question would be, is the DADI program still, DADI funding criteria still unserved, or have we included underserved in that?
So our definition, actually, the federal government considers anything unserved below 25/3, below 100/20 unserved. So we capture both categories in one, aggregated. And so we're in line with the federal definition. We just collapse these two into one category.
Okay, Nicholas, how many do we still have left? Do you know that are?
I don't want to steal Chandler's thunder. I think he's going to talk about it in his presentation, but
Okay,
a little
that's
over, we'll share some numbers of what we
that's
think.
fine.
Chair, just
Yes,
a quick clarification on the question of when does the funding end? I think you're referring to American Rescue Plan Act, because there is a complication with all of this. If BEAD money is combined with American Rescue Plan Act funds, the locations that are served by ARPA funds have to be delivered to by the end of 26, sorry, and the money has to be encumbered. So there is a challenge there. You need to move a little bit quicker. I think everyone at DHCD realizes that. Otherwise, you're going to lose the access to those ARPA funds. If those ARPA funds aren't committed, then there's a possibility of clawback. So there's definitely a risk of not putting those ARPA funds into play sooner rather than later.
And we've allocated all of the $750 million we received, both body and the American Rescue Plan and capital projects have actually all been allocated to projects. And so we checked the box on that department. And so the projects are currently being built out with the anticipation of they have to be done by 2026. And so the BEAD funding is coming in more towards the tip. We would allocate the money, hopefully, depending on the timeline of the federal government, by the end of 2024 and being spent by 2028.
and if any of those are not meeting their deadlines, are you able to recapture that and try to allocate it so we don't lose those?
That we would have to ask the Department of Accounts. They actually oversee that funding, and so I'm not sure. I do know that we did, when the administrations changed, we took over the CARES Act funding that was allocated under the previous administration, and so there were projects that returned money. That money went right back to the, and so I'm not sure into that.
Yes.
I don't know if you're gonna, talk about it, but I would like to know about accountability for the providers and getting the work done appropriately and how you're managing and watching for that.
Yes, and we can share some details on that as well. And I don't know if we want to put that as another BAC agenda, but we can actually go through how we do. We have an entire laundry list of things that we check before we issue actually $1 for reimbursement to the providers. And so next slide, I think. All right, and so my last slide is, the next piece is around affordability. And so to the extent funding is available through the Affordable Connectivity Program, promote the use of that federal resource for broadband affordability by increasing utilization within the state. We currently, as a state, eligible residents, we're underutilizing that program. Of course, that program is prescribed to families that fit certain buckets in terms of poverty, being on SNAP benefits or Medicare or Medicaid eligible. And so we as a state, to a certain extent, aren't getting our fair share based on the folks that are eligible. That's actually something that's happening across the country. It's underutilized. And so the goal would be to increase utilization within the Commonwealth at least by 5%. The other piece is that we do have a federal communications performance using to increase marketing and awareness of the program. And so we're in the process of developing that marketing tool to push out through public health. So the last piece is, to the extent funding is available, do a statewide needs assessment to develop programs. And so, again, I don't want to steal the team's thunder, but the $1.48 million will be enough to close the digital divide from an infrastructure standpoint and allow the Commonwealth to start looking at other use of the broadband around adoption, because if you build it, it doesn't mean folks will take it. And so things like smart farming, business support, telehealth, telemedicine opportunities, look at opportunities to maybe provide devices, but in a sustainable, long-term way, such as computers and tablets. I can't tell you how many times, and I know you all probably heard it during COVID, the students were given laptops and Chromebooks, but our seniors didn't have devices. And so that's one of the things that came up a lot during COVID around seniors weren't able to do their telehealth or telemedicine visits. And so we still hear from senior advocates about that need there. And then the last piece is, again, just because we build it and folks take it, that doesn't mean they actually know why they should use it. And so promoting digital literacy and navigator programs in partnership with institutions across the Commonwealth. And so again, being able to close the digital divide from an infrastructure standpoint and start looking into how do we increase utilization of federal subsidies to cover the cost, but also looking at adoption and literacy. So those are the and if there's anyone has any questions or comments?
Yes, so when you talk about developing programs, for all those different things, are you talking about, grant criteria or what kind of programs are you referring to?
So we're required under the BEAD program to do a lot of stakeholder engagement. And so we'll listen to stakeholders who would like us. Maybe we'll hear from the ag folks and they say, we want to look at precision ag and smart farming. So we would work with those stakeholders to develop a grant program. And so we would be able to give grants for that. And so the same thing with digital navigators. The Library of Virginia has a lot of libraries that set up training librarians to teach folks how to utilize the internet and see. And so because these are places we've never invested as an office and looked into, we have to go through a whole stakeholder process to develop those programs and eventually give out the BEAD money for grants. Yes, ma'am.
So will you come back to the advisory council
ma'am.
on all of those?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to the team.
So continuing on the BEAD program, we've condensed about a 30-slide PowerPoint presentation into 4 to cover volume 2. And if you want the full presentation, come to Thursday's input session on BEAD volume 2. We're excited and looking forward to that. We published this. We're the first state in the country to publish this a couple of weeks ago. Now, it's a 50-page document that boils down the federal requirements of the BEAD program. We incorporated the flexibility that we have at the state broadband office into BEAD. It will cover what, in my opinion, are the 2 most flexible areas of scoring criteria and the sub-grantee process. Is the application.
Is it 50 pages, the federal, problem?
The federal document is 98, but wow, we got it. So we'll cover what this is, and Cole, you can go to the next slide. I don't want this to seem like an elementary slideshow, but we want to cover too, like how to read and how to cover volume 2. There's about 30 different federal requirements that we incorporate into our state grant making process for broadband providers. 2 of them are completely discretionary. These are all on the next slide. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide too. Another subset of them are mandatory to include, but we have some flexibility within them. And then 17 are completely mandatory. And this may be a poor analogy, but I think you'll find in the BEAD guidelines that a lot of the questions from the federal government is in the following steps, right? Describe how your state, Virginia, will draw Clifford the big red dog with a red marker, black pen, and a blue sky in the background. So as a state broadband office, all of us across the country are going in and answering these questions. Virginia will pick up the red pen, draw an outline of Clifford the big red dog, color it in with a black ink pen, and draw a blue sky behind it. That's about 3/4 of the document. So I think you'll find that we've incorporated what is mandatory for us as a broadband office to prescribe to for the BEAD program. And the 2 flexible criteria that we've got are on the next slide. Well, if we can go to that one. The first describes the application process. And I think to understand this, we have to do it in the context of the body program. So in the current model, local governments, broadband providers, they draw their own application area and bring it to us as a broadband office. That goes through the challenge process, existing areas that are already served or removed before we issue a funding decision. Under the BEAD program, the challenge process happens first, and this where Tamara's numbers that was previewed earlier comes into play. We've preliminarily identified about 162,000 locations that are unserved and underserved that have been left out of a project area. We think that's gonna come down to the challenge process to about 125,000, but neither one of those are official numbers at this point. We'll know in December the exact number of locations that have been left out of previous projects and are still without broadband access. This first pre-application process will start January and February timeframe of next year, and it's when a broadband provider brings us the areas they're interested in the BEAD program. Saying earlier, the body process, the application areas are brought to us. We're trying to mimic that here, but we have to standardize bidding areas under the BEAD program. So we'll take all these letters of intent, study where the overlap exists, and form application areas where providers will submit like proposals so we can compare apples to apples. And because we can't compare one subset of 500 locations on one side of the county and another subset of 500 locations that somewhat overlap, but not entirely. So that's our only way to study and compare and score like proposals to be. That's what the pre-application phase is for. The full application is what is proposed as a 90-day window for providers to submit all of the documents and criteria that were outlined from the previous slide, as well as the scored and evaluation criteria that are on the next page, if we can go there. So there's this long of a list of things that are required in the application, but there's this long of a list of things that are scored, which are on the screen here. The first one is the cost efficiency of the proposal. So we're proposing to give 45% of total points to what the cost per passing is. And because that's the same application area, we're able to compare apples to apples, and the lowest score receives full credit in that criteria, and then whoever's higher than that gets proportionally less points. The affordability of the proposed gigabit service package is also scored and evaluated at 20%, and fair labor practices comes in there at 10. I don't want to continue to hammer the point of to allocate 75% of scoring criteria across those three categories. So it wasn't like we could give 50% total between those three categories. We had to go a full 75. Could go more, but we wanted to save back 25 points per percent for those last three criteria of how fast that network will be built out. And then the last two, we're trying to mimic what we do under body. Of course, under body, local governments have complete authority to select their preferred partner. But under BEAD, we're giving them the opportunity to, if the provider meets and consults with that local government, they'll get 10% of the points. And then if that local government provides a letter of support or some form of endorsement, it doesn't have to be financial. It could just be a letter of support from the board of supervisors, and they'll get another 10 points added on to their proposal under BEAD. Again, it's our way of trying to carry forward what the structure and the intent of body has been onto the structure and the BEAD.
Is that already done?
So this is we've got the scoring model, but this is still up for public comment. So tweaks or their suggestions are absolutely encouraged.
I would think that if you already have the broadband provider consulting with local government and you're at this point in the stage that I think speed to deployment is a lot more important than a letter of support. So it just seems to me, since you only have a limited amount that you're allowed to use down there on those last three, that deployment would be, one of the ones, unless the providers want to speak differently to them. It seemed like that would be very important.
Right. I agree. It's a tough balance to strike. 25% flexible support.
Has that been an issue in your past ones you've given out? Is it one of the criteria in the baddies?
It is. It's under the body program. The application usually comes in a defined timeline of how quickly that network can be built out. Sometimes it's 12, 18, sometimes 36 months for larger projects. Under the BEAD program, it's tough, right? Because you can score what's on paper, but as an office, we've got to go through a pretty intense vetting process to see whether or not that's realistic. And I think with the challenges we're going to hear about later in the field, sometimes what's the timeline on paper is not always the timeline that's realized in the field. So I think our thought process behind the 5%, which seems low, is because it's hard for us to gauge whether or not it's an appropriate timeline based on what we're seeing in Britain.
And we received some comments from providers now, even on the awards that were made in December of 21, that are reconsidering a blanket extension of all grants. And so I said, no, not yet. We're still early in the game, but I do know that all the investments we've made, even probably with the ones that we made this May, are still impacted due to COVID. I mean, supply chain issues, labor shortage issues. And so we do anticipate the need for some extensions, but we want to look at those on a project by project basis because each project is different. The localities are different, partners are different, the terrain is different. And so maybe some smaller projects may be able to be built according to their original schedules, but for the most part, we've already not provided extensions, but some timelines have already been adjusted, not to extend it out past the deadline, but to make adjustments so far. So we have actually had that came up at the conference when we were in Indiana, and so I have a note for us to look at all of our projects and talk to the providers about their current proposed timeline and what they anticipate it will actually be based on, what Mr. Carr will be discussing later this morning.
Yeah, we'll hold that up.
Yeah.
With that, I'll turn it over to Cole next. Part of this, volume 2.
All right, thanks, Chandler. So we already went over some of these, so I won't. The third one about the timelines we discussed. And again, I want to reiterate before I start that this is still off the public comment, so this and the next couple of things I'm going to go over are our drafts that we sent to NTIA out for public comment, and we encourage everybody to provide your feedback. So just some frequently asked questions for BEAD, because it is, a pretty extensive program with a lot of requirements. First, the BEAD program has a fiber preference for fiber technology at the federal level, and so there's an extremely high cost threshold, which is called this link. What we'll pay, the maximum amount that we'll pay for fiber service to a certain location. We set that for in volume 2. We planning to set our extremely high cost threshold following, reviewing all the applications in time. So we can sort of, examine the applications and see where they are. And see the direct impacts of what the threshold will be. If we don't receive a proposal for an unserved or underserved area with BEAD, then our office is required to actually engage directly with broadband providers. So we'll go out, meet with providers to try and work with them to extend service to areas that haven't had an application come in. We already discussed the timeline, but again, just to reiterate, 4 years after the project's award is announced. And then providers will not have to submit all of your application for every single application. All of your application narrative for every application. So you just do it one time, and then you can have different applications based on the project areas. Go to the next slide. Cola. Yeah, that's good.
You go back to the threshold for, the amount of money. I'm sure DHCD is gonna take into consideration building the line in Rockbridge County.
Yes.
A little bit different, you know, now, maybe somewhere where Sandy Soul's at on the eastern side of the state. Okay.
That's why we want to wait until the applications come in. We've heard a lot from Delegate Austin and Spencer Suter, who are both from Rockbridge, and so yes, and I would encourage, as the gentleman has said, so for folks to submit public comment on that as well.
At this, on point number 3, it says, what's the timeline of projects, once awarded? And it says 4 years. Is there any way of checking, or there any reports made, during that 4-year period to see what progress is being made? I'm having some trouble in my area in Southside with projects that have been awarded. With no progress whatsoever. I had a phone call this morning on projects that have been awarded and involved several counties, and they called the provider. They got very verbal information and not satisfactory. So I just wanted to be sure we got some way of seeing that these projects are being done incrementally, or wait till the last minute to find out that you got a little problem.
I appreciate the question. I want to make sure distinguishing between state funds and federal dollars.
Big federal.
Right. In state funds, we receive monthly reports from localities, providers, and each other based on those. The federal funding that's been awarded by the Communications Commission in previous rounds only receives, they don't report to us, right? They report directly to the federal government. I think those reports are quarterly. Some friend maybe on that one. Folks that have those federal reports, but we don't receive those in office once a year. Right. So there's The short answer is no, we don't receive reports from those federal dollars. We will under this program. We've been given that authority to be the reporting recipient underneath.
There's accountability. We can't draw a dollar of the federal money from their treasury, from federal treasury. And so we actually show that money has actually been spent. So there's at least 2 levels of accountability, well, 3. The provider to us, and then us to the federal government, and then us back to the general assembly.
And further, I have a facility, electric co-op in my area is active in the areas of broadband. And they get complaints to them that, this other company that's government, want to stop the grant, you can't take it over. And I want them to go cancel. I think it's not doing it. When the award panel rather than say the timeline.
Right, so it's a very lawyering and legal conversation to have between some federal state, so we just can't take the obligation of forcing that wire to build out those locations. But we are kicking the tires on seeing if we can deobligate those dollars federal, have local authorities built now that have adjacent state projects. So we're having those conversations, but it's been roadblocks up until this point to get the control away from those federal obligations to us, so we can fund it with equipment provider.
And I will say this is the issue across the country, Delegate. This is not just the Commonwealth state or the providers in your area stating to the Federal Communications Commission that someone that has a federal award from them is not performing. This is happening across the entire country. And if with BEAD, these areas are prohibited from BEAD. And so we can't even say, okay, let's fund it through the new BEAD funding. It's written and it's especially mandated that we cannot touch those areas with this new money. And so we're having conversations on what if. And so what if 2 years from now, that same company still fails to build out that area? Would it then be eligible for BEAD? And so a lot of states are having the conversation. But also the federal agency administering both those awards as well as the NTIA administering BEAD. And so this comes up every time we're together with other state programs.
We just have some good files.
Yes, we do.
And sites out, good attention. They're awesome. Or
We discussed this where we were discussing the federal funding that was distributed a long time ago and how those areas, a lot of those were in the rural areas than the hardest to serve areas. And because of that, those areas are even now longer delayed if they're prevented or crossed out of the map because they're considered served, even though they're really not served. So what you're saying is local government has to, and others have to communicate with federal representatives and our own Virginian that is up there directing the broadband deployment of money, correct? Very good. So we have a direct connection there, so I think that's where we should correct some of those, but it's a real issue. Some of those were very long-term, and those were the areas that really needed connectivity. I mean, they're really left out.
That's part of the reason why when we did receive the additional, the money back in 21, if you remember, we incentivized accelerating that most recent auction, which was the RDOF. And so we said, if you come in for body, you have RDOF, you can not pair the two together, but leverage them with one another to build out in 3 years. Those federal entities that on that award have 6 years to build, 10 years for the money. And so that's why we see areas that Delegate Wright is referring to still not built out, because I think that clock ends in 2028. Depends on when the award was made.
Yeah. So some of the agricultural programs you talked about developing for farming and what have you in the rural areas, are those going to be considered not eligible in, or will they be looked at differently because they weren't really a part of the old funding? I don't believe, because the technology wasn't there, was it? Or will they? Will they be considered an area that you can't go into as well for anything you come up with for farming?
Under BEAD, you can't. You could under state general funds with a couple of guidelines, that's, but the BEAD program, we can't fund a line extension, or we can't fund a broad deployment in those areas.
And I don't know how many of those there are, but maybe we need to really address how many there are, so we know what we're talking about. And is it a small group or is it a large population? And, I think that's a big part of this issue to gather.
I think another thing might be helpful is just to re-clarify what is OPB versus the other side. So that everybody is clear. Of their jurisdiction.
There is already said.
Third more committed federal fund, other federal funds.
Maybe it'll help us from a numbers perspective. In terms of the number of unserved locations in Virginia that our federal lead allocation is based on, that's around 440,000. How we got to 160,000 was taking out all locations that are in an existing body project, all locations in an existing federal project, because we're required to and double fund locations. Under the-
Well, you must have those separated then, right?
We do, we do. Yeah, we can go back and bring back to the next council meeting, but that's how we got 440 to 160, was taking out all those funded obligations in areas that are in progress being built.
So I would like to see that information, and if you can get it before the next Friday meeting, I would send it out to the members.
I think Jimmy had a question.
Yes, I want to make a point that I'm gonna also make and read comments to the HCD later this week. But I think council members should understand, this first question is a very, very important policy question, all right? So the B money says, the assumption walking in is states have got, their program has got to be set up to prioritize wired fiber broadband. Then each state gets to set a number, which is its high cost threshold, that says if it's gonna cost on average this many B dollars or more to serve that location in fiber, you can consider alternate technologies. I hope Tamara and team, you will really consider setting that number, or at least putting out what you think is the high cost location before applications come in. Because you're gonna get a better indication of what's possible, and you're gonna force providers to compete with one another if we know what that number is. If we're all guessing, it's gonna be, I think it's gonna be very, very difficult for you all to unscramble the egg if you don't give us some guideline about where you think that number is gonna be. I think that's waiting until after all the applications have come in to set that number is gonna, in my view, have some negative unintended consequences.
I would love to have a further conversation about that, because in essence, and I know we're being recorded, so I'll be mindful of my verbiage. I also don't want folks gamesmanship, which we know what's happened on with the previous federal programs. And so I'm working on trying to schedule broadband. We kind of like when we built out the body program and all the industry folks sat at the table, we talked about how to make this, I'll have a real conversation about that extreme cost threshold, because what I don't want to happen is folks do the same thing they've done in federal often, to be honest with you, they come in and get system. We need to have an understanding of what the interests are there. So I take your point into consideration. Well, it's also been recommended that we consider waiting by NTIA based on the applications coming in. And so we can figure out a crosswalk between the two.
Yeah, or even if it's just take some industry guideline up front, everybody's gonna. The number's not final until we evaluate everything, but we're gonna guide you to a range, just some way of, because otherwise, if you set it too high or way too low, I don't know how you're gonna efficiently award the rest of the money. It's going to be impossible for DHC to sit down and work with individual providers to fill in the gap if that number is, like, at least the general range of it is not known to industry, because otherwise, like, that's a very important number. Like when we, and everybody else, when we think about, where our e-applications are gonna be, that number is very, very big for determining what we do where.
Okay, so I'm gonna go over now, a very important requirement of the program. That's again laid out to the low cost service option. So this is a major requirement of the BEAD program, and directed by Congress was to affordable broadband and low cost service options. Basically, a service option that the provider who's it's a BEAD award, it's required to offer, they're sort of based in BEAD territory. So we have to define this low cost of service option, submit that definition to NTIA for their. So
Oh, so this is your definition?
this is our definition of our low cost of service option. Pending
Okay,
public comment,
I have a question about that.
their proposed definition.
Okay,
So I'll go over,
are they allowing you to change that later or this, because they're talking about setting a definition, you have costs, which inflation is just changing that, you know, daily, weekly, whatever. And you have $30 per month. And it talks about useful life, the network asset, so it talks about a never ending change to that. Is that what that, I just want to make sure I understand what that means.
so.
And then who's monitoring that? That's being, you know, that there's, you know, we had some issues with unemployment, other things with fraud and other things that might occur when some of these situation changes. So who's doing all that?
So we actually have a two-tiered system in this, and I didn't go over this. There's a lot of information for this low cost service option. It's on 2 slides, so I want to make sure it's all of it, but first, the proposed definition is a $30 a month plan that you can submit a waiver to our office to move up to 50 if you don't believe you can demonstrate that you can offer a $30 a month plan. Also, an important element of this plan is that the low cost service option is that it's eligibility restricted. So our proposed definition of who's eligible for low cost service option is that the eligible population cannot be restricted further than the eligibility requirements for the ACP program, which things like 200% of the federal poverty level. A lot of federal programs. So this low cost service option is also restricted to a certain population. It's not, required to make it available to everyone. Just going over some of the specific requirements and proposed requirements. Should offer at least 100 megs over 20 megs minimum. Typical latency measurements of no more than 100 milliseconds. Not subject to data cap surcharges, usage-based throttling. And then $30 or again $50 for the other waiver. That's inclusive of all fees, taxes, and charges billed to the customer, including anything that's on the bill. Ultimately, this will be $30. And then, if the applicant offers a low cost plan with higher speeds at a later date, required to make that plan available to the customer. For the next slide.
Wait, so on a question about this, because I want to make sure I understand. So the providers already have a lot of these programs. So now when they're trying to figure out what B funding, they have to honor this part in their price that they provide to cover a certain range. So you need to know what your population is, and you probably need to know that anyway. But now the federal government's controlling it, which they do in my work. But in this case, you're not offering the low cost speed program, is right?
No.
Or they offer it. And then my other question is they don't have any data caps. So somebody else that is paying more for unlimited means that there's no caps or usage based, anything in that. I just want to make sure I'm reading it right.
So this is a plan that we as a provider would have to offer $30 a month in order to get the, how many points do we give it? 10?
Because the federal rules, we don't score all of this. This is a requirement, but the scoring is based on the pricing and your gigabits measured per package.
Okay, so the provider has to offer $30 a month. And under the proposal, it's basically to anyone who would already qualify for the ECP program. So that means we have to offer a plan that effectively gets an end user a zero out-of-pocket cost. Sounds really good. But look around and see how many providers, even in competitive areas, have a $30 plan. Remember, any decision you make here is going to impact how many dollars for currently unserved location is a provider asking for. And if you're only collecting enough money from your subscriber every month to cover operating expenses, you are gonna need more public money support to cover your initial capital costs. Like, this is not a free choice. This is an approach I think that several states are talking about taking, but this will dramatically drive up compared to what Virginia has traditionally seen, the average number of dollars per household that providers are asking for in their applications.
Yeah, which is why,
Just math.
yeah, which is why we have the $30 a month and then the waiver, if you can't offer it, you can offer one up to 50. So we put that out for public comment to hear them. We've looked at, I mean, the reason we came up with the numbers, $130 a month is the affordable connectivity system payment. But then we also know based on previous rounds of auditing, how much the lowest cost plan is from each of the providers that come and participate. And so we thought between 30 and 50 max was the middle ground. And so we want to hear from everyone what's the middle.
And then the proposal, just to read the 45 or deployment would basically be this package would be 4,800 or 100 extra package. Correct.
So on the current affordability plan, for take this off first. Are those opted in or do they have to apply?
They have to
Right.
apply.
What we're talking about here is that there is no application, there's no into it. They would just automatically receive it if they were in that designated.
They would have to provide they qualify.
Providers that participate have to go through an FCC approved channel to verify that someone saying they're entitled to this discount is actually entitled to it. There's a lot of fraud in this direction of this program. So the FCC no longer lets the ISP do that with good reason. So we go through a third party. And I presume we would use the same structure here. So most of us who do this, it's a condition of state and federal programs, you have to offer the ACP. You have to get set up with an approved third-party provider. And we make it as easy as possible for the customer to demonstrate upfront that they're ACP eligible. And then once a month, when the billing cycle runs, our billing system talks to an FCC billing system and says, you know, customer with unique identifier A1234 as all points is reporting them as a recipient. Now, what frequently happens is the customer A1234 has also used their $30 a month benefit to pay their T-Mobile bill early. So it's not perfect, but it's an okay system. It's just a transaction cost to set it up and get it working.
Are you saying that person and that's what I thought I heard you say.
I mean, somebody who is not the ISP is going to have to objectively determine whether or not somebody meets criteria. Mechanism in place to do that now. It's not perfect, but it's not terrible. It just, you can't just have a customer self-select and say, yes, I qualify. So right now, you can qualify on, you know, our provider basically a different, you provide your tax returns, you could provide evidence that you've been to a school that's on a list where everybody's on a certain number of people on free or reduced lunch, so various criteria. 70%, I think, is 70% of people who apply for ACP through our portal qualify for what the provider calls instantaneous verification. Instantaneous means less than a day, so for your expectations. And another 30% can take longer than that. It just depends. Like, for example, we see if people are eligible because they're a member of a tribal nation, that's not something that can be verified quickly, so more stuff goes back and forth. It's verification based on their taxable income and their last tax return. You know, they put in whatever information they put in and they government can verify that quickly.
I guess my question here is that a couple minutes ago you were saying that this could create ownership for liable.
What I think there was the ISP is only collecting $30 a month, regardless of the source. The math is such that that's covering the ongoing operations, but it's not helping to pay for the initial investment. And so the lower you put this number, the more providers are going to ask for unserved sold in order to build to those areas.
Has the FCC, another question is, has the FCC stated that the ACP isn't gonna go away since $30 subsidy? Is this? Because we understand we're setting these expectations up front, funding. That's just something we want to be confident with going forward too. Okay, if we're gonna make it a wash 2 to 5, let's make sure that this is going to be here on that.
My understanding, there's a big push at the advocacy committee, so to make sure that ACP sticks around, I think you say maybe by the end of 2024, do you think by that? Mid 2024, and so I hope that someone is paying attention because they're also trying to set these limits that kind of close with ACP, and so I knew there's a movement to try to keep the ACP moving around. I don't know, but we can't anticipate that it will be around by the time we even make these movements.
So are you saying this goes away when the money goes away?
No, the federal subsidy to help cover the $30 a month may or may not be around before we even get this grant up and running.
But it says the useful life of the network assets. How would you define that in the bylaw?
I mean, right now, we, 30-year asset on the fiber itself, 5-year on a piece of electronics. I don't remember what definition to use.
Okay.
I think there's a 10-year federal trust period in the,
It's 20. It's 24, it's 20.
okay.
So you're
There's a lot of
talking,
different timelines out there. Yes.
so they could be 20 years at $30 a month. And you figure that into the money you're getting from the BEAD program to pay for that? Is that what that's saying?
This is basically just a data plan rate that the providers will use. to also-
Somebody's got to pay. Like you said, nothing comes free.
Well, I guess if ACP goes away, then the end user is now. Okay, it's all $30, they qualify for this data package, which is $59 for anybody else who doesn't.
Saying that's really way out.
Sure. It's a starting point for public comment. Yeah, I want to discuss it.
Yeah, good with this. Actually, more, just a few more things on the. So. Okay, so we'll move past things for the. So these are just moving on to another part of our energy proposal volume 2. You're required in volume 2 to address non-deployments. We've referenced a couple times today. What happens after you've used all the necessary BEAD funds to serve every unserved, underserved community anchor institution. Whatever funding is left is used for non-deployment programs, which is really not anything but anything broadband related that's not specifically deploying network infrastructure. So we identified a few priorities for how we'll approach non-deployment in our final proposal and beyond. Should we have funds left over after deployment? So first is just that the non-deployment program and fund actually generates a return on the investment for the Commonwealth residents, so that the non-deployment program has a impact beyond just one generation of funding. It's actually sustainable, and the impact that it generates sort of lives beyond the initial funding. That it addresses an identified component of the digital divide, so that it's not. This is where our digital opportunity plan that we presented on last time is going to really assess the digital divide in Virginia and sort of not expose, but identify, where there is digital divide beyond just virtual access to broadband, but adoption, digital literacy, what we're calling digital opportunity. So we want our non-deployment programs to actually address an area that we've identified where Virginia hasn't. And we want the solution to be innovative, so that it's not supplanting, but supplementing, or it's an entirely new problem that's being addressed in an innovative way. And then capacity and experience are really important here, just that the organizations that we subgrant to or work with to do these non-deployment programs have the capacity necessary to manage what could be large programs, the experience necessary to manage the funds. Successful organizations ultimately that are running the programs have the experience and capacity necessary. Then don't have any questions for this. So This list, I don't have to go one by one, but this is the list that NTA has provided in the notice of funding opportunity of what activities are eligible under non-employment in the BEAD program. So it's things that a lot of these fall under what we call digital adoption or digital literacy, user training for, teaching people how to actually use the internet, or upskilling, remote learning, telehealth, smart agriculture, digital navigator, stakeholder engagement, capacity building, and then just other activities related to non-employment that haven't been defined yet. It's a pretty new venture, so this list is not exhaustive, but sort of some examples of what a non-employment program could look like.
Yeah, that completes volume 2. Questions? I do have one in the chat. Steve Sandy asked earlier, is there any consideration given to geographic areas when considering the maximum amount that Virginia would pay for location to serve fiber underground versus area? So Steve, maybe it helps to clarify too, the structure of the BEAD program. Let's say we splice Franklin County into 3 different application areas. Every provider bidding on each of those application areas has to account for the same build cost, right? We award the maximum points to the most efficient proposal for each of those 3 application areas. The fact that it's, they're on the ground and aerial location. So that factor is program, not because we have to go in and wait underground versus aerial construction.
Non-employment. BAC is critical. We're thinking today, or is there no longer a need? In other words, we're saying the BAC needs to participate in non-employment decisions. Can that be done legislatively, or is that something that's already? That's my whole question. I want to put some together that the BAC is important to this process. Or is it not? Is it another agency? I heard earlier that it is the right relationship.
With that in the language.
Well,
It's not, I don't think it's broadband deployment.
We can always tweak that. Certainly, you don't get concession till January, then there's always a budget that loves to pick up language too, but as the legislators know. But I think the whole idea all along, and you can see the Broadband Advisory Council has been very effective. It was through that we created the BADI program. So I don't see that role going away, but I understand specifically what you're talking about, having some authority in that decision making.
as staff, we'll continue to bring the full content of BEAD, which will include this non-employment stuff in our split. Yeah.
I want to thank you publicly, all of DHCD, for the hard work that's gone behind this complicated process of combining body with BEAD. So congratulations, all the hard work, really appreciate it. So out there in the hinterlands and rural areas. Thank you.
Yes, it's been quite a mission. You've done a great job. Thank you.
Okay, we get. And then when I'm walking, want to thank the team. It has been a Herculean task to try to figure out the BEAD program. Because we've, had the flexibility of having state money, we've been able to come up with a really great program that's a national model. And it's my belief that will continue to be a national model. I will say, I was in Orlando last week and consultant to, because our plan is now public, we're going, we really like your plan. And so I think there'll be a lot of, flattery in terms of research and development on what we put out for public comment. We call it rip off and duplicate, but a lot of kudos. We are the first in the nation to issue that for public comment. And so I want to thank the team at DHCD for making sure that not only we didn't rush to the line, we were already working on this months in advance. And so I'm thankful that I get a chance to lead such a great team that continues to be a model for the country and our providers who without you all, this would not be happening. So I also want to thank our internet service providers and our cooperatives who all have been in kind of dominions and I think Amanda Cox is on. So without our investor-owned utilities, our electric cooperatives and our ISPs, Virginia would not be where we are today. So I want to thank everyone in this room for the great work and I look forward to hopefully retire before we finish the year. We're definitely making sure we get the program up and running and really being able to look at non-deployment. That's something that we have not been able to do. And so the non-deployment, to your point earlier, will complement what we've already done, making sure everyone gets access. And I will make a shameless plug, the digital equity work that we're doing with the digital equity fund that we received from NTIA. Some great results from communities that are doing literacy, digital literacy, some great results around just interventions that have been done with some of that planning funds and how much knowledge has increased of folks that English is their second language or they're not as computer literate, and some great literature that we'll share with you on that planning process. And so with that, I know Delegate Byron wanted an update on the line extension customer assistance program, and so I'll give you an update on that program. And so next slide. And so as of August 17th, we received nearly 500 applications from residents across the state. 166 have actually qualified via the program income requirements. If you remember, if you're below 133,000 and some change, you will qualify for this program. We still have folks that have not fully completed their applications, and we do actively reach out to them via telephone and via email to work with them. Staff are also available to go out to homes and help families complete the process. 120 projects are currently ongoing. 89 of them are currently under construction. 31 have been completed. We've built 41.7 miles of line extensions, and the average line extension is 1,914 feet. And so that kind of speaks to how far several of our homes are a distance off the road.
One question. So, you said going out to the homes. So are all these applicants individual applicants?
Yes.
I thought some of this was coming from the counties as well.
We do allow counties or an ISP, if they come across the family, applicant can apply directly, and then we also get.
Maybe they have some neighborhoods that I know that around some rural areas that had situations like that. Are that's where that would take over?
Some of them, a lot of them also will come through the body programs clusters, and then also potentially will come through the BEAD program. We do have some homes that are really cost prohibitive. We've not set a cap on the line extension program, but we have gotten some really expensive cost estimates from providers, almost $100,000 more per household. And so we're trying to balance that out.
And if I can just ask, so you said 133,000.
Yes,
That's the income.
that's the max.
So the individual, okay. Because that was the average in an area. So if you have an area that has some expensive homes and homes that aren't expensive, the ones that are mixed in there, that are the lower income, can get this on those long passages that have to go to their homes.
And we'll also work with families. There are some, if you remember Christie's note, that if you talk to someone who might be a producer or an ad producer, and so while their income may look really high on their tax return, which is what we often get, we do take into consideration their expenses as it relates to the business. And so we really work with each family to figure out, there are families that have incurred costs because their children need special education needs. And so we look at every single family to determine who qualifies. And just to share with you, we've actually only turned down about 10 families because they were over income thus far based on the application.
One thing that I think that I think we and both had a budget amendment this year that would remove the cap for the limit cap so that we could service limits, so it's just hopefully we can stay in budget. Yeah.
Yes. All right, and so just to kind of give an update on the providers that are participating, the number of projects by provider. So we have 17 that actually are participating in the program, and to date, Citizens Cooperative has 76 projects, Comcast has 11, Breezeline has 9, Chantel has 6. These are representative across the country, across the state, from Coalfield all the way to the Eastern Shore. Cox Communication and Point Broadband have 4, Eastern Shore Virginia Broadband has 3, and Virginia Technology Services 1. And so we have a large breadth of providers from across the state that are participating in the program. And so other updates, and so one, we have officially published if anyone remembers, was that last year? The county and city broadband profiles are officially published on the DHCD website, and so we can send that link out to you all. And so any person that's interested in how broadband is going within there, and I see you pulled the Roanoke County. So this is the Roanoke County's profile, and it talks about, what Senate district. We talked about the new district versus the old district, which is why these were delayed a bit. And then so we talk about how many have broadband access, how many lack broadband access, if there's current body projects in that area and who those providers are. And so this information is available for every single county and city in Virginia. And so we'll continuously update the data as we make more investments. And then to your right, this is just a screenshot of the body project dashboard. We have added the projects that were awarded in May of this year to the body dashboard. And so like I tell everyone, it's like being back in 5th grade when I used to color in. I did not go in a map of Virginia. I'm half Virginia. And so I colored in a map of New Jersey. And so every time I look at this map, I'm like, every time we do a project, we get to color in a part of the Virginia map. And so I was actually at a conference last week, and they forgot the Eastern Shore on the map. And I said, that's in code. You can't forget the Eastern Shore on the map. And so I'm like, we have projects out there, so you can't leave the Eastern Shore off the Virginia map. But I'm really excited about, again, that the work we're doing. We're able to color this map of the Commonwealth on getting broadband access to everyone. We're actually working on a dashboard through the Digital Equity Act funds that we received through the Digital Opportunity Plan to also start mapping the assets. So who is doing digital literacy across the state? And so you'll start seeing body projects, and you'll start seeing layers of folks who are doing digital literacy training at local libraries, or who's providing device distribution across the state. And so we'll be able to start seeing not only how we build out infrastructure and provide access that way, but also around adoption and affordability. And so with that, I officially close out the presentation. Does anyone have any questions at all? I know it's a lot of content, BEAD is a lot. And so we can also do some BEAD 101 sessions for individuals in front of the council if you all just want to take a deeper dive and understanding the program in more detail. It's a lot. And now I'll have Jimmy Carr will be presenting on.
We're gonna take a 5-minute.
5-minute break.
While they get ready.
Yeah.
And, just be able to stretch your legs, do some.
Thank you.
We're gonna start it shortly.
Kitchen is across the hall diagonally. Restrooms are directly behind the swings.
Hey.
Okay, is that my cue?
Get started.
So, I have a presentation today, that I collaborated with a couple of folks on to get some more specific data. Make ready is something we've all talked about as a challenge. This is a pretty detailed presentation. I'm not going to go into every single little piece of detail. Part of the reason for putting this together is so people have a reference to refer to in the future. This is a pretty complicated area.
Would we be better waiting to the end for any questions because it's so long?
I think you can ask, if it's a question that comes up, I'll either ask it and I'll answer it. I'll say I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
We'll try and do that. I'm also going to start with a couple of disclaimers. This is a very complicated and complex area legally, so I'm going to be very oversimple with the legal rules. We're in an electric co-op facility, and I'm surrounded by people who know a lot more about the electric grid than I do, so I apologize if I, hopefully, to the extent I generalize, I'll get those right. I also want to make really clear that this is not a blame casting exercise. This is something that Virginia, the ISPs and the electric utilities, everybody is aware of this. Everybody is working on it. We have a long way to go. But this is something we've been talking about publicly with the investor-owned cooperatives, the electric cooperatives, and the ISP community for more than a year. So I want to be crystal clear. This is not a blame exercise. This is intended to help you all understand what a Herculean effort is in front of us. And it's really good news that Virginia started because other states are going to start coming to this in about 18 to 36 months. So let's see if I can. Do you still work there? Still on.
I think the utilities knew what was coming.
All right, Shannon, you want me to just sit in your chair? Okay, it's working out. All right, so pole attachments. So the first principle is that in order to promote both competition and the provision of telecommunications services and to encourage deployment, federal law, various federal laws over the years actually require owners of utility poles to grant telecommunications providers, ISP, access to their poles. There are a couple of background rules. That access has to be made available on a neutral and non-discriminatory basis. You can only deny access when there is a legitimate safety or capacity issue. And the specifics of the terms that you offer access to the poles on, so for example, the rates that you charge and the terms and conditions of the attachments have to be just and reasonable. All of those kind of background principles are typically each individual ISP will go to each individual pole owner and negotiate a specific pole attachment agreement. Those agreements are kind of governed by the background rules, but then there's a lot of specifics about an individual ISP or an individual pole owner that will get into the details, and that those will be set out in individual pole attachment agreements. Again, there's a lot of vague terms in here like just and reasonable. And so there are a set of federal rules that very clearly apply to the investor-owned utilities. So in Virginia, that's AEP and Dominion. Those are also the kind of primary source of truth for non-investor-owned utilities in determining what is just and reasonable, what the procedures are, what makes sense. Some of you will be wondering halfway through this presentation, well, Jimmy, if it's this hard to go above ground, why don't you just bury everywhere? The reality is that going underground typically costs at least twice as much as attaching. And so that's why the issue of making the poles ready and attaching to them is so important for stretching baby funds as far as possible. Okay, again, pretty basic principles here, but I think it's important for people to understand this, and you'll find you start looking at it on poles when you drive. What is on a typical pole? All right, so up top, You have the three-phase primary distribution wires. Sometimes that could be just one wire, I think, in rural areas, but in the more suburban areas, it can be three phases. That is high voltage power going from the substation. Then down below, that gray canister is a transformer. The function of that on the electric grid is to take the higher voltage power and step it down to the voltage that is needed for ordinary residential use. The next wire down, labeled D here, that's the power neutral. That's kind of close, balances the system on the grid. It is typically the lowest electrical thing on the pole, which is why it matters. And then you have the service drop, J. So that is, you see those wires are coming out of the transformer, attaching to the pole and going off the pole line. That's what's delivering power to an individual home or business. And then you'll notice there's about probably almost exactly 40 inches between D and K. So D is the bottom of the electrical stuff. That's the supply space or the power space. You have to be an electric lineman to be up there. It's dangerous. Communications companies don't go there. The power companies handle that. And then down below in what's called what are called attachments. That is where phone, cable, fiber will be. This pole looks like we actually have 3 fibers, but you know, this is kind of basics. What's on a pole? You've got the power space up top, 40 inches down below the neutral on the pole. You have K, which is where attachers can go. Same view in a more urban area, high voltage up top. There's the secondary line, whole bunch of stuff, communications attachments in the middle. This pole doesn't just have wires, it's got a telco video electronics. That's probably a Fios video box. That is the box Fios uses to provide its linear video product. Then you've got these guy wires. I'll come back to those later when I talk about pole loading analysis. Those are to help the electric pole manage changes laterally, so it doesn't fall over in a big windstorm. And then those guy wires go down to the ground where the pole is anchored here behind the fence. All right, so that's the anatomy of the pole. Next, why is make ready required? What are we doing? There are 2 things. Think about clearances and then forces. Okay. So the first step is clearance. So the National Electric Safety Code sets the rule for all electric utilities. And it has certain minimum distances that have to be maintained between stuff. I don't know all the requirements up in the power space. Gary and others will know that better than me. But the idea is you have to have a certain minimum distance between electric stuff and communication stuff so that things are safe. Makes a lot of sense. We measure those distances not on a reasonably nice, calm day in August, but when it's really windy in a 10-year ice storm. Right? That's important because all those stuff on the lines, they're made of different things. They sag at different rates depending on how much wind is on them. And so what we do, depending on where you are in Virginia, you analyze, okay, how much ice is on those wires in the 10-year ice storm? How much does that weigh? And we have to make sure that we maintain all those clearances. So that's first clearance, distance between stuff. And then you also have distance between the lowest thing in the pole, the lowest thing on the pole and the ground, right? So that will differ if you have wires above a sidewalk and there's no space for vehicles to go underneath. You can sag, again, during the 10-year snowstorm, ice storm, down to 9.5 feet. If you're going over a VDOT road, the number is much higher. If you're going over a railroad, you might as well build a skyscraper, I paraphrase. But the different requirements, and those are in the National Electric Safety Code. So that's clearances. The other part of make ready, and there's a lot more variability in this, has to do with lateral force. So it's not distance between things. It is what happens to this pole when everything on it is covered with ice and the wind is howling from the west? Is the pole strong enough that it's going to slip? Or is that going to knock the pole over and cause unsafe electric conditions and disrupt communications? Okay. So that force loading is called PLA, pole loading analysis. And it depends on which utility you're attaching to, the specifics of their network. There's a lot more discretion about when and how that is done. Okay, so you know why we have to do make ready. What does it actually mean? So make ready is going out and doing whatever needs to be done to that pole so that during the 10-year ice storm, everything is far enough apart. And if the utility requires it, studying to make sure during that 10-year ice storm with the howling west wind, does the pole stay up? How do you do that? Ideally, I don't even put this, but the first thing is you study the pole and there's enough room and it's strong. Great. No make ready. Issue me a notice to proceed. Everybody signing it, we all love that. Not more frequently, but so if that's not the case, a kind of escalating level of cost and complexity, the first thing we can do. Hold phone line on that pole, and technically it could be moved down a little bit. And there's now room to put fiber between it and the power, and you've got enough space above and below, right? It's costly, it's a little annoying, but that's not so bad. The next thing that you can do is move electric stuff. So for example, a transformer on that pole, we could move it up 6 inches, and if we do, there's going to be enough room to put a fiber attachment and still maintain clearance. The third thing you can do, again, in decreasing order desirability from the temperature standpoint, let's just say you've got 2 poles and they're 500 feet apart. It's a really long span. And there's a farmer's field between those 2. And we've got to maintain during that 10-year ice storm, 18 feet of clearance, and we really want more than that, over the field. And it may just be there's no way, unless you made both poles way taller, to maintain that clearance. So what kind of interim solution is to say, just go add another pole at 250 feet. That'll pull everything up. So that's called a mid-span pole. And the last, most expensive, most time-consuming thing that nobody really wants to do, but is unfortunately necessary, is taking an existing 35-foot pole and replacing it with a bigger, stronger, and taller 40-foot pole. So that's kind of make right. I mean, there's 4 options. So how does it work? The very first step in the process, which nobody really sees, but it's very time-consuming, is called fielding. There are a couple different proprietary platforms and software, but all of it basically breaks down into the ISP sends a vendor, it's almost always a vendor, out into the field, and they go to every single pole that's called for in the design, and they take 4 pictures of it to determine what's on it at what height, right? That you're establishing the baseline for what are the conditions on the poles today. You can see on the bottom left, that is a more rural pole, so there's not a whole lot of stuff on there. There's a software kind of computer generated image that you take those 4 pictures of the pole, and the software has told us that, up at 22 feet, 1 inch, there's some electric stuff. And according to the analysis, so all points should be attaching its fiber at 22 feet, 5 inches, right? The pole in the middle down there, that's a little more suburban. There's a lot more stuff on the pole. The image on the bottom right, there's no pole. But remember, we're looking at the mid-span clearance. So this is a driveway that is between 2 poles. And we need to make sure that during that 10-year ice storm, people can go in and out of that driveway and be safe. So you're not just taking 4 pictures of every single pole. If there's a mid-span something that has a clearance requirement, you got to measure that too. Okay, so that's fielding. Then you do some engineering. So this is a great example of pole loading analysis. Typically, and this varies significantly by region and by provider, we would expect to do pole loading analysis on about 10% of poles. Okay. Pole loading, nobody likes it because it is time consuming. Like one reasonably good engineer can do 30, maybe 35 poles a week. So that's So what are we looking at? You can see on the left here, this is existing condition. You can see the orange line there, that's the electric primary up the top, and then the purple is that neutral. And you can see the pole is red and it's bending to one side. That's because the software, SpottyCalc, has figured out that in a 10-year ice storm, if the wind is blowing from 270 degrees, this pole fails. Pole will snap, or is at risk of snapping. Okay. So engineering says, oh, you see on the right, draft, replace with 43. That's saying at a 40-foot class 3. Existing electric attachments be safely accommodated. You can also put fiber on there. And even in the 10-year ice event, the pole's not going to fall over. Okay. Now, key point here, on the bottom left, that pole is failing current standards before any new fiber is attached to it, right? And it's the same thing like if you had an old building, you might have a handicap ramp, or you didn't have one. It's fine today, it's grandfathered, but if you put money into it, you need to upgrade it, right? And so these are poles, we're going back and touching them. So the electric utility standards may require you to fix that pole before you can do anything to it. Obviously, everybody wants the one on the bottom. Actually, everyone wants the example, which is the pole is good today. But in rural areas, you typically have much older plant, especially in electric cooperatives. That's not a knock on them. It's just the reality of those networks deployed a long time ago. The poles are older. They're shorter. They're not as strong. More work is generally required. Okay. So then what happens? And again, vastly oversimplified. I'm trying to condense this into a period that people will still pay attention to me for. Pay attention to the color coding on the left, okay, because this is going to correspond with some charts I'll show you later. So what happens? We do the fielding. I showed you that. People go around, they take the pictures, they analyze the pole. Then the ISP, typically this is contracted out or partially contracted out. We do all that engineering, that tiny calculation you just showed. We do all that information. And that's all when we're in what is the gray period. That's a to be submitted ticket. And once all that information is done, we submit that application, the data that we gathered in the field, the engineering conclusions we've come to, those go usually electronically to the pole owner. Okay. So on the far right, you can see the timelines that the FCC has established for so-called large jobs. These are obviously large jobs. So once the application is submitted, the pole owner has 60 days to take a look at the application, grade the quiz. Did you figure out everything? Is the make ready? Do we agree that moving that transformer up by 6 inches is really the best approach? Is that part of our electric utility standards? At the end of that process, the electric utility sends back a cost estimate, and they'll say, okay, all points, you want to do that? We think it's going to cost 11 grand. Once the ISP says, okay, we agree. Now, sometimes the power company will come back and say, that's going to be 100 grand. We missed something. We'll say, okay, maybe that's one where we do want to go underground. But generally, if the estimate comes back and it's in line with what we think, we tell the power company, okay, we approve your estimate, go do the work. They've got 105 days to actually do whatever needs to be done. Swap out the poles, move stuff around. Then, we're still in yellow land. Once that work has been done, if there's an existing attacher, typically a phone provider, or if you have to build through an already served area to get to an unserved area, you might have an existing cable attachment on the pole. They've got 30 days from when the power company says the work is done to go to the old pole and move their stuff onto the new toll. And then, and only then, does the ticket turn green, meaning that the new attacher can go out and have what's called an NTP, notice to proceed, attached to that. All this stuff is happening in the background. One thing, I don't know the specifics, but like it's kind of frustrating for policymakers and the average citizen to say, oh, well, I'm not seeing a lot of fiber construction. Fiber construction is the very last thing. In many respects, it's the easiest thing. All this other pole by pole stuff is all happening in the background. It's not as visible to people, but it needs to be done. The other thing I want to call out here too, with all my number 2 bullets, every single one of these steps is typically either partially or wholly outsourced by both the internet service provider and the pole owner. So think about what's happening. Everybody is trying to do a whole lot of make ready at the same time. So the demand, and this is before BEAD money starts coming, this is, but nationally there's incredible pressure and limitations on the labor force that can do all this work. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about costs. So I mentioned earlier, so the charges that can be imposed on the ISP who wants to attach, they have to be both actual and reasonable cost. Key principle here is that this is not a money maker for an electric utility. They're being made whole for having to change their system to accommodate somebody else. The next general rule is that whoever is causing the cost causer, has to pay for it. So I don't, there's a third-party attacher, depending on some specifics. If the third-party attacher's got to move, they're only having to move because somebody new is coming. They're generally not responsible for that cost. They didn't cause that cost. Exception to that is if there's an existing violation, for example, the poles that failed their field before an attachment was made, that's not on the new attacher, that's on the party whose current assets are in violation. This is a very real-world example of that issue from Hanover County. So if you look at the chart here, this is a pole loading analysis from a couple hundred poles in one part of Hanover County. The gray stuff is in process. So the green, 47, a little over 47% of the poles, they pass all the relevant standards after a new attachment is made. Great, home run. Everything in yellow, which in this case is 35% of the poles studied, they fail before a new attachment is added. Okay, so those poles still have to be replaced. That's not part of the Beatty budget. That's not coming out of the all points or another Beatty award winner, but those poles still have to be replaced. And then another 15%, the poles in red, those are failing because of the attachment. And so in that case, the ISP, the new attacher, is the cost causer, is responsible for those costs. Key point, regardless of who's responsible for them, before the fiber can be built, all the poles, not just the red poles, also the yellow poles, have to be brought up to snuff. So there's a real cost that never show up in a Beatty report, that nobody ever sees them except the electric utility. They have to replace those poles. And the timing of replacing all those poles, red and yellow, absolutely determines the speed at which.
How
So
many do you have to attach to?
so in the county, I know because I gave a presentation last week, that's 10,000 poles. We'll have some real world data. on that.
Distance between the poles, what is it? What
Uh,
constitutes how many poles?
There's lots of electric guys in the room, but generally, we would expect to see in a suburban to rural deployment, again, depending on who the pole owner is, the average span length is going to be somewhere between 225 and 275 feet. In some areas, it can be a lot longer, but it's pretty highly variable. I'm looking at my electric friends.
The attachments on how many attachments you have to make, daily power, really depends on how you design your system. So, a lot of design now is going on and basically just following what we call following the electric design, because everybody has electricity. So it's very easy if you look at designing a fiber system. So in some cases, you might touch every pole, 80% of the poles. It all just depends on what the construction is and how you need to get to those houses. But for the most part, you will touch a lot of them if you're using that methodology of just following power to get into the home.
How many attachments can go on a pole?
Depends on how tall and strong the pole is. Generally, these are very sweeping generalizations. Rural running poles in a co-op territory, you're hoping that there's room for one additional communications attachment. You'd be lucky if there was room for 2 or 3. Because these poles went in like the 20s, 30s, and 40s when nobody was thinking about, hey, we're going to come back and put some new technology lower down on the pole. So they were designed to meet the minimum clearance requirements. And now we're adding stuff after the fact.
So if you have an attachment on there and someone else wants to come along and attach, then that makes that pole not workable.
No, then the new attacher is collect that data. They gotta go through that analysis. They go to the pole owner and they say, hey, we've studied these poles we want to attach to. There is or there's not enough room on each one of these poles. And the electric company will say, yeah, you're right. 8 of these 10 poles, there's enough room, but pole 4, you're gonna have to make taller. And pole 7, we're gonna have to. So again, the utility is required, unless there's a reason they can't, they're required to make the pole ready. But if you are the only reason why the pole needs to be replaced, you have to pay.
And what's come up in a couple of projects in Southwest Virginia is the rising of the coal. So in some project areas, it's not even the electric facility, it's another telecom actually owns the pole, which is a whole different conversation.
Right, and those poles are, the reason why a lot of universal broadband deployments are mostly focused on electric attachments is for the reason Casey just said. Power is going to everybody, so there's an aerial route to each home.
We have a question online for who is it?
Christy Proctor.
Christy. Hey, Christy.
Yes, hello, thank you for allowing me to ask the question, Madam Chair. Jimmy, so question for you regarding obviously the delay that can occur if, you know, there has to be updates done to the polls. Is there a certain constraint on the time limit there? You know, is there a certain time limit that's given as far as how long these folks can take to make the upgrades?
Yes, so that is the FCC guideline for so-called large jobs is 165 days.
Ah,
Now,
okay. Is that
I'll show
per
you.
poll or is that like in totality once it's confirmed how many there is?
That is from the time the new attacher approves the cost estimate for make ready.
Okay,
Sorry,
thank you.
the application, 5 days
Mhm.
from the time.
Thank you.
Okay, so if you take nothing else away, I hope that you take away from this, you know, the number one thing that determines how quickly you can build rural greenfield fiber deployments, which is basically that's getting to the unserved. That's 9 times out of 10 what's happening is the make ready cadence, right? How many NTPs, how many polls of approval do you get every single month? I have a report. It's a much more detailed one at the bottom. I look at it a couple times a week. We can tell you based on how many miles of pole attachments were achieved in week 1, how many miles of construction are we releasing to an aerial vendor in week 3, and how many miles of fiber will be constructed by week 14. Right? You can set your watch by it. This is the gating factor. Now, to your point about how many are we attaching to, the amount of work that is going on right now is orders of magnitude outside of what is historic. Right? For a universal project, which is what the VADI wisely rewards, you should assume that of every single pole in that county that doesn't yet have a communications attacher, 3 out of 4 of those are going to need to go through this process. And that is just, and I got some more specific stats. That is just orders and orders and orders of magnitude more than what people are used to. And again, this is something we're all working on, and it's a known issue. Industry is doing its best to collaborate to get ahead of. But if you look out across, so the chart on the bottom, again, this is what we look at Make Ready, shows you the status in a handful of counties where this project's going on. The height of the bar is the number of poles that the design says that we're going to be attaching to. It's the height of the bar by county. And then the color code of the bar tells you where those poles are in the status. So remember a couple slides ago, I said, pay attention to the color code. The gray stuff, when we're either fielding or doing our engineering, you can see those. So all those poles in Hanover and some in Augusta, those are, we've collected them because we have the count. We haven't yet submitted an application. Okay. Once it goes from the attacher over to the pole owner, the pole becomes yellow. And then at the end of the process, when it comes back and you get that final notice to proceed, the attachment turns green. All right. And it's a really simple way of showing what's going on. So let me show you some real world examples. So this is Northumberland County. In Northumberland County, there are 5 FSAs. There are 5 kind of rings that each have their own cabinet where service can be provided. Okay. Now, we don't make, you got to get the light all the way around the ring before you can offer service to anybody, right? So we're not going to offer service to anyone who lives in North 3 until all of North 3 is built. Okay. And you can see North 3 is just a teeny little sliver of yellow at the top, right? So there's some handful of poles. Well, in this county, we have already gotten 1,099 attachments approved. You can see that on the right. We're waiting for notice to proceed on 252 poles spread across all 5 of those FSAs. Now, you might say, all right, why don't you build most of Northumberland 3 and then wait and come back later? We have to do that. That's much less efficient for us. We want to hand over a package to a construction vendor and says, here's North 3, it's permitted, approved, go. Because then they can just get up and go. It's much more efficient. Can't always do that. Very rarely can we do that. Now, and I have David Walkerson here. This is something, again, not blaming Dominion. We work very closely with them. David and I talk about pole attachments probably 3 or 4 times a week. The average age of an application in Dominion's queue in this particular county is 234 days. Okay. For those of us doing math, 234, and this is as of probably last Friday, that's 69 days more than the 165 day federal guideline. And it is not a coincidence that our construction is about 2 months behind schedule in North Carolina. Look at another county. Here we are in King William. Same issue. Remember, you want to get the whole thing green before you build. Okay? And here, the 2 electric utilities here, again, we're working extremely close with both of them. I'm not throwing anybody under the bus. It's just the reality that is happening in rural Virginia right now. We're waiting for 3,723 poles. That's how many. Now, this is after we've surveyed a whole lot more poles than that. This is after you've done the efficiency activities and the value engineering, the 3,700 poles you're going to attach to. For 183 or 179 days, respectively. The average application, you can see a little bit higher, has been pending in the power company's queue for 142 days. And another little nuance here is depending on the utility and the software and the procedures that they use, we don't always know if they're going to be able to finish King William 3 so we can, you know, line up construction vendors a month or 2 in advance and say, here's, right? So we're trying to coordinate, but we don't have a lot of visibility into the details of individual tickets. We know how old they are. And depending on the utility and the working relationship, we may have good or not good visibility about when they think they're going to actually get around to that straight part. Okay, this is the key point. Now this is one utility, Dominion, and one ISP, all points. I'm not picking on Dominion, it's just they own about half the polls, so it's a good representative sample about what's happening. Over the last 120 days, you can see at the bottom left, we are submitting 2,700 tickets a month. Those are monthly average. I don't have this exact number for Dominion. I know that that is orders of magnitude more than what they typically get. On the right, you can see the average bumps around, whether you look 90 days back, 60 days back, or just over the last 30 days. But in general, Dominion is averaging 700 polls a month of NTP. So 2,700 are going in, 700 are coming out. That means a backlog is building up in the middle. A 200 poll a month backlog. And again, this is a vast oversimplification, but if you assume they're about 25 polls per mile, that's 80 miles of last mile construction that is being added into a backlog every single month. Right. Just math. That is what's happening. Again, this is a snapshot. I have the best data. We attached a lot of Dominion polls. We have a very good relationship and share a lot of information. This is what's happening with one ISP and one large investor-owned utility who really wants to help. Right. So I'm part of these projects. Dominion is part of these projects and is trying to do it. And that's where we are. Well, again, this is the situation before BEAD money that we spent the first half of the meeting talks about flows down and doubles the amount of broadband funding in the system.
So why? You have a good relationship, so why is the backlog? Is it labor? Is it poles? What is the,
It's engineering resources. It is, in some cases, electric make-ready components like transformers turn out to be very hard to get. It's also because, and I've got slides on other, again, not picking on Dominion, now we work very closely with them, but it's just, the systems were not designed for this tidal wave of activity. Right, resources weren't lined up, things, it's like a lot of applicable attachments are just accidents in history. Oh yeah, that's the way we were on it.
A lot of the stuff we're seeing with power and, to Jimmy's point, goes into where we've heard a lot about 811 emission children's tickets. It's where a volume has hit an industry that just wasn't ready for it. We're not used to it historically. We're not used to it. Another part is, and Jimmy touched on it, is a lot of times we've had poles now that you can get pole or make ready work in 5 visits. Now sometimes we pick up to 16 weeks just to get those poles in. So it exacerbates an area where, you know, you start at the Permian end and now you can't get the materials to do the actual work. It just stretches everything out. Kind of like we've seen on the 811 side, we could really be doing a lot of work construction wise, but we were waiting on that companies to get in, mark the ground so we'll know where we work safely at. And it's it's a pretty big task, because every utility, we don't want to add on additional staff to do these. Window into our history, so we are leaning heavily on contractors to come in and do that work for us. And, for the most part, it's getting done pretty efficiently. It's just the speed about which is happening, it seems like it has become one of the big, hurdles we have to get through.
And Casey, we've heard two things. One, solar is also, in some communities, solar is also competing for the same
Yeah.
similar attachments at the same time. And I'm trying to think what the other one, and then there's just private investment that's happening from your traditional telecom companies. They're still expanding broadband, throughout the state with their own private investments. So this is not even just body, it's private investments on the telecom side. And I know, at least when we were talking about one of the projects, solar companies are now also needing to attach, and some communities are doing a lot of solar right now, some communities.
Solar's attaching to what? The poles?
Oh, right. Yeah.
A lot of the stuff they're getting now is requiring some of the same communications that we're getting, requests for ourselves. Solar needs these communication facilities to operate efficiently, to work with the host utilities that they're providing to make sure, they work safely and operating in the manner that the utility wants it to work. And given a lot of the things Jimmy's talking about, a lot of providers, including us in Mecklenburg and Powell, we've taken a stance where maybe we're just gonna push a lot underground to get away from some of the, hurdles that the make ready has started. Cost wise, it is, some costs, but if you look at the additional costs of change down all the pole timing, it maybe becomes a little bit more efficient, but then again, that brings in different issues itself. It's something that we're seeing in Virginia. We're way ahead of the curve, but I don't think this is going to be isolated to us in Virginia. Other states are going to start seeing it. They just have not gotten there yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just like you said, one of the other big factors in this is cost, as we heard people say. What I've seen happening, and it's happening in the locate business, it's also in the make ready. All those contractors, prices now, some of them have doubled. There's limited resources to be able to do the work, so they can charge basically what they want. And if they're being paid more to work in North Carolina, they're gonna go to, that's where they're gonna go do the work. And then they're gonna come to Virginia and say, look, we're making X amount of dollars in North Carolina. Your cost has to come up here for contractors, locators, all of that type of work, which is top when we're all working. Budget that we built 2 years ago when we put our applications in. And the other piece to that is, I don't know how Jimmy designed his network, but he probably designed where there's aerial, you design it to be on aerial because that's the way to go. And if now all of a sudden you've got to shift to underground, your costs are going up a huge amount.
Rule of thumb is underground costs twice as much per month.
So has this affected our applications yet, as far as, where do you go when your costs have changed from your original application? Are you still at a point where you can eat that cost, or are we going we're going to be going back to Batty with adjustments?
I haven't gone back and asked for more money because I think I know what the answer is.
Federal site has a reputation for a single vendor working with patterns and different vendors. You have read for conversations.
Yeah, so I think you're referring to what's known as the one-touch make-ready rules. And there's that last box that said other attachers have 30 days to move. Believe it or not, incumbent attachers weren't in a big surprise, in a big hurry to get out of the way. And there was some mischief about that. And so the FCC stepped in 2018, I think, created what's known as the one-touch make-ready rules. And they just basically say that if there's an incumbent attacher who's had more than 30 days and haven't moved, that a new attacher can engage in self-help and go out and use one of the incumbents' approved vendors to go ahead and move the attachments. That in Virginia is not happening all that much. I think, at least in our experience, the bottleneck for us has not been incumbent attachers moving. We're mostly building the areas that are unserved.
and people, there's a pretty good work, like, there's just so much work and so much activity going on. People are not looking for ways to make additional friction that other vendors may, provide experience, but this has not really been a big issue for us as it has been in some other states.
Yes,
So you have really well laid out the problem. What can we do in the General Assembly or?
We get to that in the last slide.
Okay.
Are we getting there?
Yeah, we got 2 slides left. Okay. So this is another example from a co-op who's a great partner of ours we work with extensively. I got this data from them. Between 2018 and 2022, the average number of monthly pole attachment requests at REC increased by a factor of more than 10, from 6 to 85. The blue is bars there, the kind of their baseline. By the end of this quarter, just in order to keep all points projects on schedule, they've got REC is going to have to be able to process another 1,250 poles per month. Now, I mentioned we are not the only ISP in the world. So REC also has an extensive partnership. They have other attachers who are doing baby projects, who are doing their own organic builds. And so that volume is going to keep going up. You'll see, again, not picking on REC, not picking on Tomato. This is just happening everywhere you look. Remember in the background, not only is REC responding to applications from attachers, they're also building their own 800-mile middle mile network. So there's a lot of the same resources and expertise that go into that, where they've already, I think they're projecting to replace 600 poles. And they have a very active partnership as part of Firefly, where they expect to have another 3,000 poles. Now, the good news here is that it can be done. So this is an example on the Northern Neck. Before they started working with us, the Northern Neck Electric Cooperative was averaging 6.25 poles per month. That's a period, not a comma. We spent an extensive period of time. We had leadership, board of directors there, and the staff who really wanted to be part of the project and part of success. Beginning in 2022, we worked with them to totally overhaul the way that applications were submitted and we worked together. First thing we did was automate everything. We had a lot of these processes, paper used to work when you're getting 6 a month. It doesn't work when you're getting north of 1,000 a month. And creating that type of visibility so everybody can see what's happening where, what's in the queue, what's your priority, what's my priority, how do we move wherever. Another key thing we've done is joint procurement common vendors. Rather than us use one vendor to do the fielding and then use a second vendor to go check the first vendor's work, which leads to a lot of this, we just said, no, let's procure one person, one vendor who's going to work for both of us. We have totally unified our materials forecasting and supply chain and procurement functions. Like we literally warehouse material at NEC's property so that they have a good view about what they're going to need, what we're going to need to stay on schedule. And also the most important thing we did, I think, was to make a public commitment to the members of NEC, to the counties who were involved, that NEC was going to get to 1,000 poles a month of NTPs. You can see here that between 2021 and 2022, we began stepping up. And then in 2023, year to date, NEC, which I think is one of the smallest electric co-ops in the state by meters, has hit 1,000 poles a month, every single month. So it can be done. It's just there needs to be a willingness and understanding of the issue and a willingness to really do old things new ways. So final point, I said it before, make ready is the bottleneck. This is the major issue we got to get ahead of. The scope of work that's going on is truly unprecedented. And this is something that, throughout industry, regulators, policymakers, everyone need to understand how important this is. And as you saw with NEC, it can be done, but it's going to require resources and focus. In terms of what can be done, I think that DHCD said earlier this was this scoring component. Right ahead of this is a scoring component. At the end of the day, this is a resources challenge. There's a finite amount of time. There's an absolute amount of polls. There are only so many people who can do it, and despite again every participant's desire to move as quickly as possible, it's just there's an absolute flood coming.
Other states have set up, make-ready specific programs. I know that, Kentucky and Ohio both have full replacement funds to help with maybe those yellow poles that need to be upgraded. I wish there was a really simple, oh, you could just do this, Senator. Haven't come up with that yet. I mean, we're trying everything we can. We've got, this is something that All Points and our vendors and Dominion and all of our electric operator partners, we're talking about this on at least a weekly basis.
Yes, go ahead.
Jimmy, you mentioned the labor force initially, but just looking at the scope of all details that are part of the situation we're looking at, it sounds like we're fairly okay with labor. Is that correct? I mean, it's not the crux of the problem. I thought it would be a significant part of the issue that we have shortage.
From my view right now, from what we're seeing, it's probably representative, but I wouldn't guarantee that, the skilled labor resources, all that engineering, both on our side of the fence and at the electric utility to move those tickets through, that's the bottleneck. Now, if you expanded the capacity at that step in the funnel, my guess is when you got to sending the crews out in the world, into the world to actually do the electric make ready work, you would create a new bottleneck there. I know anecdotally, just talking with folks at electric companies, there is, as I understand it, a declining. It's harder and harder to find electric linemen. And remember, the work is taking place in the supply space. You need to be an electric lineman. Again, there's only but so many of those around the state. So I think, right now it's the challenge is more of make ready materials and kind of the engineering and designing labor. That's a pinch point. But I think that to the extent we continue to improve and smooth those out, you're also going to have limitations at the end of the process.
Yes, what is it?
I was just gonna comment that, I mean, we've all been at this a while now, so we know what the problem is, but I think it's good that for this next round of ADA application, that's been added into the scoring, is to make sure that those discussions are maybe happening as quickly as possible up front on make ready, because that's gonna be part of the scoring process now. So to the extent we can think about those things, I mean, you're not necessarily gonna come up with a solution to any of them, but to at least make sure anyone that's applying has considered that, because it's now a scoring issue.
A lot of people up at Center Blue Skills are.
So we know that there's limited, the funding has to be used and the projects have to be complete within a scope of time, right? Do you see this as causing a significant problem in getting the projects completed?
Yes, make ready is the number one issue that not enough people are talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, not a secret to anyone involved in doing it, but this is the number one bottleneck. There are other bottlenecks, there are other difficult things, but for our view, this is the number one issue.
Well, get back to the labor concerns and specifically the linemen. That's one thing that in Southside, two of our co-ops are teaming up with the community college. And we've got a program that trains these linemen, and they'll go to state to get training. They just right there, they got jobs, house, field as soon as they get through the training. It's been very, very successful. That's one thing that maybe a small help, but in other areas, the ones trying the same thing, that would relieve at least part of the problem.
Yeah, that's a good point, Doug, right? But keep in mind, and I'm speaking from the electric utilities, we're competing for resources. Dominion's got huge middle mile projects going on. Gary's got huge projects right behind. So even though that we are producing a lot of linemen, and you're exactly right, if you graduate that course, you're getting a job that very day you walk out of that program. It's still a challenge, and it makes us have to prioritize where we send our workers, which areas we're going to start on, because we have to work this in a very organized fashion, because we can't just kind of shotgun approach it and send people everywhere. We just don't have those kind of qualified
resources yet at the.
Michael.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Just want to recognize Ray's got a question, so I hate to go in front of him, but he's okay with me doing so. Right, nod ahead, yeah, okay. So I'm gonna take a different approach. I noticed this photo up here has no telephone poles along the lines there, but there is an example of what I think is a trench going through the property, maybe. I think there's micro trenching as an option. You know, you're spending so much money on pole replacements, and the poles themselves are becoming more and more dangerous in effect. I mean, the Frederick County storm, I think it was earlier this summer, they knocked over what, like 40 poles, and it took like 3 or 4 days to get the road cleared. It just seems that there may be a better approach. It's going to take time. And micro trenching might be an example of some of the things that you could do. I've often said that VDOT has to play a better role. They have control of the roads. The poles are running along VDOT roads. Why isn't there some sort of mandate that VDOT put fiber in, or at least conduit in, every time they do any type of additional road construction? Just seems that there's a way out of this because, you know, Dominion, as an example, continues to do their strategic underground placement. There's a lot of money that Dominion is putting into their grid that is taking poles that we never thought were going to disappear, and now, you know, they're doing a lot of great work in that regard. So we just don't want to leave out the ours and other options.
Sure.
And that's-
One thing I just want to interject here, that I always was very pleased about the advisory council being a big part of looking at challenges, not just, I mean, the updates are important now that we have money and we're making progress. But I think one of our roles is looking at the challenges and looking at innovative ways and ideas. So I would suggest at a future meeting, you know, we could have a presentation on some of those things, bring VDOT in, bring, you know, different people that can address some of but we have to identify those. That's how we got started in getting the VATI program going, was looking at the ways that we could progress on the unserved areas. I want to thank, we still have some questions, but I want to thank Jimmy Carr for all his work and bringing this forward for us too. Ray Lemare, you want to give us a question or comment?
Yeah, I'll provide a little bit of both. First, thank you, Jimmy. You did a masterful job in explaining this from the industry perspective. I think you did a masterful job. One thing, if you could, because one of the things I know we are experiencing, I'm sure you are as well, is part and parcel with the application process, the review process, comes a dollar commitment and investment from the industry. And oftentimes what we're seeing is our applications and permitting requests are going in along with a check, and it's sitting there for months on end. And that is a tremendous source of frustration where we're required to make this capital investment and it sits. So that's a significant frustration. And before I let you answer that, I hear what Mike was saying about the micro trenching, and that just adds a host of massive other issues that we've had to deal with in the legislature relating to easements, for who owns the easements, especially if you've got residents owning easements. And that's I appreciate thinking those lines because we need to think as many different options as available, but that is another host. I think we've all seen the recent battle of folks who own an easement. But Jimmy, maybe you could expand a little bit about the timeline when we have to make these dollar commitments also.
So, that's a good point, Ray. A lot of these systems were designed for an Aeroman, 12 requests that month was a big number. And so a lot of systems, you have to have one specific check linked to one specific estimate that you have to put in the US mail, no kidding. And it's got to go to a specific PO box, and then someone's got to open that check and report it. Sometimes those checks get lost, or sometimes there's confusion. It's a great example of an old process that no longer makes sense. I mean, another example we're having, similar with VDOT, I hesitate to bring this up, but, you know, we have a lot of VDOT permits pending at any one time. And we want to just post a $10 million bond with VDOT and move on, so they don't have to, you know, they don't have to get paid. Well, VDOT doesn't have a form pursuant to which they can require a bond, we just don't have it. So you can't actually go out to a bonding company and get a bond if you cannot show them the underlying contract that they are providing a bond on. So it's just like, all of these processes, that's why, you know, all stakeholders need to be involved in making these as transparent and automated and efficient as possible.
Okay. This is really helpful. This is very helpful. So are you completed with your?
That's all I got.
Okay. Before we go to public comment, any comments from the members? You know, I would like to say to Mara, the group, that, you know, you mentioned something about just in conversation when we were talking about something else, feeling that broad extension, you know, or extension of the projects from your applicants. And I don't know if that's the criteria of how you determine that. I would hope that we're not doing that. And the thing that concerns me that I think that we ought to be aware of is, like I said, the data's good. We would like to hear from you too, because you're the inside voice that hears the problems. You know, we realize we're not all trying to micromanage, but we can't possibly be helpful if we don't know what some of those issues are as well, until we start hearing them locally, which we're all starting to hear about some of these projects that, you know, haven't done anything and we don't know for what reason. We know there's issues with labor and with supplies being available, but we don't want to just automatically assume that those are the problems when they're not. So we want to be as helpful as we can. You know, government's here to help, not necessarily solve everything, but we want to make sure that we are working for the citizens that we serve and doing what we can to make this all work. But we need to hear more from you. Not that we're trying to hear negative or that we want all your problems, but please include those in our discussions as well, so that we can, you know, everybody thinks everything's rosy when you leave, and we know there's challenges and that you're managing those challenges. But I know I've got some issues going on in my area as well, and you know, that Wright does, and some of these were mentioned today with the federal funds and all those barriers that are out there. So I think it's important to continue to let people know that they still exist and that we're working to overcome them and do whatever we can. So comments from, yes.
I would just say, you know, as the chair Byron said, like setting expectations with our public is just going to be critical for us to be able to communicate with the people in our, you know, districts that, yes, we know that you have a body project or a B project going on, but the timeline is going to be this, so that we can set expectations. And if there is something that we can do to help intercede or to smooth things out, you know, we'll be right there to do that. So I agree with what Byron said.
Any of our members that are online need to make a comment or say anything? Okay, all right, we have a Clerk Jones with us that wanted to make a public comment. We generally allow about 3 minutes or less. So we appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Byron, and members of the Broadband Advisory Council and phones and staff. I'll be very short. I feel like I'm standing between you and lunch. The purpose of my appearance today is to share with you some information. I represent the communication work of America, the State Council. And we have a document that's prepared by our national office on broadband. There's some suggestions for broadband deployment. There's an example of what's been done in other parts of the nation. Also has some suggestions that we can follow as far as making sure that the quality is there in the broadband deployment that we're doing for other countries. The key is not just building out broadband. We want to make sure that it remains labor up for the long term for the citizens of the state.
Absolutely, thank you very much.
I decided to distribute that.
Is that the extent of your comments then?
Yes.
Thank you for sharing them with us, and We appreciate, what you're doing. Anything from DHCD that you wanna?
There's some housekeeping stuff, lunch,
No,
now's
Mark,
the appropriate time.
that we don't want homework, right?
No, it's just instructions for
All
lunch.
right. I want to thank everyone for being with us today as far as online, so we can probably get close to ending our meeting, and then we'll give instructions for lunch. We don't want to make them hungry while we're talking about it. With that, I am going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you. Lunch.
For lunch, and we're gonna go online, for folks online, thanks for joining us. Tell us, leave this room. So if you want to stay and join for lunch, we're just gonna ask you to bring the chair over this side.